It's more than just steel and gears. It pulls you in and doesn't let go.
Okay, hello. Welcome, Rob Henderson. Thank
Hey,
you for
Isaac.
being here. Yeah,
Thanks, man. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Of course. I think everybody's probably familiar with you, but you are the author of a book called Troubled that I'm reading. I'm about halfway through. And it's about your experiences growing up in California in foster care and then as being adopted and kind of back and forth. And it's a harrowing book. It's told in a very simple, straightforward way. It is actually great. I was extremely impressed by it, and I'm really loving reading it so far. So it's a great book. Everybody should get it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Isaac. Yeah, I wrote it to be accessible. I wasn't trying to write something to impress people with PhDs or something. I wrote it so that anyone who's curious and interested in the story can pick it up and follow along. I think towards the end of the book, you'll see. I mean, I do say something like, I hoped, some part of me hoped that, if there was like a curious 12 or 13-year-old kid out there and they came across this book, they'd be able to pick it up and follow along and maybe see something of themselves in their own lives in the story.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's very much written for everybody, and it's exciting and it's simple, but in a good way. The thing that I actually noticed the first is it's I think maybe the thing that's underrated about it is it's kind of like a 90s kid. Like it's almost like a movie or something. You talk about this succession of songs beginning with TLC Waterfalls, and then moving on to Coolio Gangsta's Paradise, and then Bone Thugs and Harmony Crossroads. And dude, those are the exact same three songs that I like if I had to pick in that succession of like the songs of my childhood that I remember, it would be those exact songs. So like the cultural touch points, is that something that you were conscious of, or this just sort of did your editor say, hey, can we get some like cultural references, or like how did you just, because that's kind of a big part of it.
Yeah, well, I write a lot about the kind of dysfunction and deprivation of growing up in the foster homes in Los Angeles, and how there wasn't a lot of stimulation in terms of interactions with caregivers. I had my foster siblings, but even those were kind of shallow because there was just a lot of moving around and a lot of turnover, where I'd go to a new home or my siblings would be relocated to a different placement. And so in a lot of ways, pop culture filled a lot of that void, whether it was TV shows or music or, books and other kinds of things. Like just I was seeking ways to occupy my mind and seek, small pleasures. And one was through music. So the early drafts of the manuscript, I would make these references to 90s era music, and my editor just happened to love it, and that kind of encouraged me to keep going, because music is such an important part of young people's lives. And it's really funny, a reader pointed this out to me, where he said at some point, in kind of the final third of the book, the music references kind of stop. And I think that's also kind of, it wasn't intentional, but I think that's the case too, where somewhere around like 12 or 13, you really get into music and you really love it. And then by your mid-late 20s, your interest, you kind of get stuck in that era of like, that's your favorite music. And maybe you get the occasional song that you like, modern contemporary song. But there's a certain point, kind of a few years maybe out of college, where you're like, oh, okay, music becomes a less important part of your life. That same reader, by the way, put this Spotify playlist together of all the songs that I mentioned in the book. So yeah, that was an unplanned kind of thing that people seemed to be focused on and that they enjoyed, which I'm glad.
Yeah, only 90s kids will understand this playlist. No, I mean, I come from an upbringing that is not anywhere near what you went through, not even close in any way. But I was, troubled in a way. And I'm an only child, and my parents were very kind of absentee. And I also grew up in a very urban environment, to put it nicely. And it's true that these songs had such incredible impact, and I think it's like, you also talk about reading Encyclopedia Brown and Goosebumps and Boxcar Children, which is funny because those are also the same 3 books that I read. But I do think it's like, if you have a really super nice family, the power of art is probably a little less present because you just don't need it as much.
Yeah, I think that's right. Where if you're getting kind of mental stimulation from your actual physical relationships and the people around you, then yeah, you're not trying to piece together that stimulation through external sources, through pop culture, through media, through what some social scientists would call kind of the non-shared environment of the outside world. And yeah, it's nowadays it's interesting because now kids are mostly getting it through their screens, but 20, 30 years ago it was much more so like, what's going on TV, what's on the radio, what movies are out, and billboards were more important back in the day. I mean, now you still see billboards, but they don't seem to hold the same kind of sway either. Where I think back in the day, like getting something in Times Square was this like massive monumental event, and now it's more of a kind of a status thing, where no one looks at a Times Square advertisement and that doesn't really like sell products, but it is kind of a more so like a vanity project more and more. So yeah, it was a different time. And in hindsight, I realized as I was writing it, it was kind of an ode to that era. There's a great book, just came out about a year and a half ago called Generations by Jean Twenge, who's a social psychologist. And she, in this book, writes about kind of the characteristics of each currently living generation. So the silent generation, the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. And there's a little bit about the Gen Alpha, the youngest generation. But she writes about how essentially like the millennials were the last, I'll just say like the last normal generation. The last because if you look at the sort of trend lines throughout the mid 20th century of 17-year-olds' likelihood of getting a job or getting into a fist fight or going out on a date or all these kinds of milestones, these coming of age moments, they kind of remain relatively stable throughout the 20th century, right up until kind of the mid-late 2000s. And then they all start plummeting. And I'm sure you and many of your listeners have seen these graphs of Gen Z is just, the sex recession. Few of them are getting jobs. Few of them are getting driver's licenses, all these kinds of things. And so I was writing about this era of like just before the smartphone boom, just before the social media boom. And in some ways I felt some nostalgia for it, despite like my personal difficulties through those times and the experiences I was having. I do kind of miss the pre-smartphone, pre-social media era too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's right. I'm so thankful that we got to experience that. I mean, it's so nice that we remember what it was like, because I really do think it's worse. I think computer world is worse than non-computer world. I think we were better off before. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think people can find each other better, right? Like if you're really isolated in your life, that's why it's like computers are sort of the perfect revenge of the nerds, because it's like, for a normal person, they were fine without computers. They are, not even normal, but just like they could meet people, they met friends, they had relationships, blah, blah, blah. But for computer people, before computers, they couldn't find each other really very well, whereas computers allowed people who would have never found each other to find each other. So it's less lonely for some and more lonely for most, I guess I would probably say.
Yeah.
But okay, so you come from this incredibly dark place in California. You're um, it's a little bit, so you have this mixed white Korean birth situation, and then
Well,
you're
yeah. White. I mean, my father, my birth father, he was Mexican.
oh, okay.
Yeah. So I point that out in earlier parts of the book. Where I didn't know this when I was growing up. I didn't learn this until I took this 23andMe
Oh,
genetic
really?
ancestry test. Kind of as I was finalizing the manuscript, I decided to take this test just to, it would be interesting for the book, and then my own personal curiosity. So yeah, like this was, well, I guess this was 2022 now when I took the test. And yeah, like, oh, my father was Hispanic. And I didn't know that, but it would have been, in hindsight, I'm like, man, it would have been nice to know that when I was applying for college, when I was applying for
Yeah,
grad
you would have been
school.
way better off.
I mean,
Right,
everything
right.
ended up going well anyway, but like
Yeah.
it's still helpful to have those little things. And yeah, so yes, my birth mother was Korean. My biological father was Hispanic. Although I didn't know that part of my heritage until later.
Yeah, and you say this thing of you had no interest in meeting them, which is and you say this thing of like that sounds weird, but every other person or many other people I've talked to in my shoes say the same thing. So describe that. Like describe why you're just like not interested in meeting them at all.
Yeah, it's I have a couple of brief memories with my biological mother, living in squalor in this slum apartment in LA in the early 90s. These flashbulb memories of being homeless and living in a car. It was just, no pleasant memories with her. I have no memories of all of my father. Never met him, and I just don't seek. I don't find it appealing to sort of seek relationships with people who didn't really want to have a relationship with me. It just, if you think about it in any other context, like I tell you about someone who, had a young child and then just abandoned them or was unwilling to provide care for them. Do you want this person in your life? I think most people would say that doesn't sound like a person I'd want to be friends with or a person I'd want in my social circle. And that's kind of how I feel about it. Like, why would I want to talk to someone like that? Why would I want to invite that into my life? And overall, things are going well. I mean, I suppose there's a world where if my life was really bad and I was seeking some form of meaning in some capacity that I wasn't receiving already, then maybe I would long for some relationship with them. I have heard these kinds of stories. They're rare, but they happen. But most of the time, for adoptees, they're pretty happy with the family that took them in.
Yeah, right. So you're in this situation of darkness. You tell you passed off to foster care, which you're in for like 4 years or 5 years,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
then
Just shy of 5. Is that 5? Yeah, about 5 years. Yeah.
yeah, about 5 years, and you have like this Miss Martinez who's like doing this weird, cruel, unusual punishment of like letting you drown,
Mhm.
and then like saving you, which is really dark. Um, how did you have such good memories of this stuff? That's what I'm always like. You're 9 years old and you're like recounting a conversation you have. Like, how do you remember this stuff? So I'm sure you get this question all the time, but how do you do that?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I only shared the most vivid memories. I do acknowledge in certain points of the book when my memory does fail me. I went most of my life thinking I'd only lived in, I think, 5 different homes, four or 5 different homes. And then later, when I went through the documents given to me by my mother, who got my adoptive mother, who got these forms from my social worker. Anyway, I'm flipping through these forms and I'm looking at the dates and I'm like, was I in 7 homes? I asked my adoptive mom, was I in 7 homes? She said, yeah. And I said, wow, I have no memory of, I think, 3 out of those 7 homes. Just nothing comes to mind. And that it's not uncommon, when you have that sort of severe instability, young children, sort of the memory starts to become cluttered, and a lot of those experiences don't encode properly in the mind. And then elsewhere, I say things like, oh, my adoptive father, he said he grew up here. I think it might have been here. I actually don't recall. But for the parts that I do remember, I try to share and convey them in as much detail as possible. And the dialogue is probably the least sort of faithful recounting because it's
Of course,
impossible.
because
It's
how
impossible to
could it be? Right,
reconstruct. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. How could
You
it
have
be?
conversation a week ago that you couldn't
Yeah, no,
reconstruct, right? But I
right.
try to get at the spirit of the interaction.
Sure.
Whenever there was a conversation that took place, where the person, like for example, my adoptive mother and I, I share a lot of conversations that she and I had, or my sister and I, my adoptive sister. And I, when I was writing the book, I called them up. I had, FaceTime calls where I would say, okay, here's how I remember this conversation going. What do you remember? They helped me to sort of piece it together. Now, of course, now you have two imperfect human beings attempting to reconstruct the conversation. But we did kind of we converged on this agreement that this is roughly how that back and forth exchange went. But I do acknowledge somewhere in the preface, I think, like, these are going to be, a lot of these are memories of a child, and they're going to be imperfect, but maybe there's something interesting in the fact that this is how I remembered it. And that might also be, noteworthy for the reader too.
Well, totally. It's like, I feel like that's like, this is what an autobiographical thing is. Like, you're going to get wrong a million of these things. That's just how it's inevitable. You're not, your brain is not a video recorder. So it's like, that's why, yeah, it's like people who want a perfect, exact, faithful representation in an autobiography. It's like, it's not a historical novel. It's not like a, history book with citations, So, yeah, so I totally get that. So anyway, so you have these very, very difficult, dark experiences until over time, I think when you're 9, you get adopted by who becomes your like permanent mom.
That's
is
right.
Is that right?
Yeah. So it was the Henderson family, which is where my last name comes from. So it was my adoptive mother. She was married at that time to a man who was my adoptive father temporarily. And then they had a biological daughter who became my younger adoptive sister. So she was their daughter. And then this family took me in, adopted me out of the foster care system in Los Angeles, and we settled in this working class town in Northern California called Red Bluff, which is in Tehama County, which is a part of California a lot of people are not familiar with. Nothing like LA or San Francisco. This is about 3 hours north of San Francisco, kind of near the border between California and Oregon, very rural. I checked the latest election statistics from 2024, and my county went something like 70% for Trump, which is highly atypical. When people think of California, they don't think of, like this kind of rural, blue collar, Trump supporting community, but that's kind of what that area was like. Very kind of white working class. And then there was a sizable Hispanic population there as well. It was probably something like 30% white, or rather 70% white, 30% Hispanic. I mean, there were a few Asian kids and black kids in my school as well, but it was predominantly sort of white and Hispanic working class.
Yeah, and well, I mean, it is inland. I think people don't really realize that California has more Republicans than any other state, right? Because there's just so many people inland, and pretty much the whole inland is kind of right wing. Yeah. So did that? Okay. So the part that I haven't gotten to yet in the book is how do you? I'm at the part where you're just meeting the school counselor, and you're just starting to. You have a really great thing in there where you don't get too much into it, which I really like because it's this kind of like masculine type of writing where you're not talking about it so much. But you mentioned that you had this switch that you could turn on that was like that could turn off the pain. Like you developed a switch where you were able to just not care.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of did that too. So what is that switch? And then the thing is, later that switch, I haven't gotten to this yet, but I'm sure that switch is actually a problem later on. Is that kind of true? So to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you have a good sense, I think, for these kinds of stories and narratives because, initially it's just a sort of a defensive response, a coping response, that I learned when I was being shuffled around the homes, from age 3 when I was torn from my mother and then placed into my first home. And then I lived through 6 additional foster homes after that one. Adopted, my adoptive parents separated, my adoptive father stopped speaking with me. It was just sort of one difficulty after the other. And then later in the book, there were financial catastrophes and family tragedies and just all kinds of difficulties. And I just responded to it all by kind of disengaging, dissociating, and throwing myself into getting into misadventures with my friends or drugs or drinking or parties, whatever I could do to I mean, it wasn't, I don't want to say like in the moment I knew this is what I was doing, like, oh, well, my life sucks, so I'm going to go drink now. It was more so like, well, I don't want to be at home and I'd rather be with my friends and it's more fun anyway. And so I couldn't have articulated and verbalized what was going on with me. But in hindsight, I could see those patterns of whenever things were really difficult at home, I would throw myself into whatever I was doing with my friends, or seeing what kind of substances I could get my hands on. Later I would get a job. I got 2 different jobs in high school, and I took on as many hours as I could there. And so yeah, it was just numbing myself to these experiences that I didn't like. But of course, if you do that long enough, oftentimes it does catch up with you. And I explained that later of, eventually I thought I had managed to overcome all of this, put it all behind me. And I think in the moment it was adaptive. I think that's the other thing I should point out is like, this wasn't a pathological thing. Like, oh, I'm just going to shut down. It's adaptive. It helps you cope. And that's how you sustain yourself through very stressful events is, your mind switches and you go, okay, well, this sucks, so I'm going to find ways to deal with it. But then later, once I had achieved a little bit of success after I enlisted in the military and had some time to kind of process those feelings and, had a bit of, a part of it was maturity, getting older, introspecting a bit. I started to journal and write a little bit more. I was reading a lot during this time and realizing like, oh, that was really tough. And it all kind of caught up with me. And, I processed, those memories in my own way that was not always productive and not always helpful.
Right. Yeah. So, there's some great scenes in there when you're like not doing drugs, you're like smoking weed at 9 years old and like smoking cigarettes and, there's also, you have a really good way of describing why a kid in this situation might do poorly in school. Mm-hmm. Like you're saying like this adult, I know what the adult wants out of me. Yeah. But I'm going to not do what they want because I don't like them. Like, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, people forget about this, that kids have agency too. It's not like we are these helpless, dependent variables, bouncing along and kids will do whatever an adult says. It's not at all like that. Like kids have the ability to listen or not listen, to be oppositional or compliant. There's a limit to how much you can control what a kid does, especially when there's not a lot of supervision going on. And so, I talk about how like early on in the foster homes, like teachers would want me to do my assignments. I wasn't interested. Eventually I was doing so badly in school that, they sent this psychologist to give me an IQ test. And some of the questions were legitimately difficult for me because I didn't know how to read, but there were others where I did know how to answer and I knew what they wanted from me. And I would just give the incorrect answer on purpose. And I think my foster mother, she was standing, she could tell that this is what I was doing because I would do this with her sometimes too, where I would do this kind of because it was a little bit fun for me to, give them an answer that they weren't expecting or to tell them something that they knew that I knew, but I wasn't going to give them that. And, over time, I think a lot of people don't understand, like if we just, fix the system and give people more money and, make sure that, kids have enough whatever resources and attentive teachers in school that somehow these kids are going to succeed. But, I tell this story when I was in high school where there was a period where I was doing pretty well in school, in middle school. And as a result, I was placed into these advanced courses in high school. And I talk about how I was placed into this chemistry class. And this was the first class that I took in high school where I couldn't BS my way through. Like I realized like, oh, this is actually going to require some mental effort to get through this class. And so I went straight to my guidance counselor and asked to be transferred out and placed into the lower level science course, which was called nutritional science. And he did what a good guidance counselor should do. And he said, look, man, like you're a smart kid. I can see, your academic track record. It's a little spotty, but I can tell what you're capable of. You should stay in chemistry and just put your mind to it, apply yourself. And I just said, no, what do I got to do to get transferred out? He gives me this form, says, have your parent or guardian sign it and we'll transfer you out of this class. And so I go home and forged my mom's signature and came back the next day and transferred out. And that was all my, however, I was 14 or 15 years old. And that was all my own agentic, decisive planning. I wanted that and I got the results I wanted. And that was, of course, after, multiple years of, all the hardships and difficulties and being let down by adults. But it's not as if like, oh, if we have better guidance counselors, that kid would have stayed in chemistry. That's not what happened there. That was something that happened in the home that was kind of years in the making for me to make those self-defeating decisions.
It's so true. It's like this, it's something with that switch that you develop that is able to turn off pain that also makes you defiant in this way. And it's like you get into this thing where you're like, well, I don't have to do anything that you say. I don't have to like comport to your anything. And it's like in a way it's freeing, but also you pay for it later on because it's like all the nice good kids, they learn how to comply, they learn how to like contort themselves in this way that makes them get ahead, and it takes a very long time to unlearn a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's very impressive that you did. So how did you, I mean, how did it work out for you? I mean, you got to be one out of what, a million, right? I mean, like, there's got to be one Yale kid in the entire foster care thing. So this is the part that I haven't gotten to in the book yet. So you can just tell me, how did you start to go in the right direction?
It was a mix of factors, right? There's always that question of nature and nurture. And I attempted to convey throughout the book, or like even early on, that I was always a curious kid and that, there was some underlying latent ability, but I was just so weighed down by all of those negative experiences that it was hard for that to shine through. That's a point I try to make in the book, is that, being, an intelligent kid is necessary but not sufficient to succeed, in a conventional sense, going on the sort of college track and getting a white collar job or whatever. You can have a smart kid, but if they are surrounded by, temptations and no role models and no one guiding them along and a lot of severe disruption and instability, then, that ability is not going to shine through. And it took a while for it to finally come out. And so part of it was I was a smart kid, but then, it was sort of fleeting moments of stability in my early life. But what really kind of turned it around was joining the Air Force right out of high school when I was still 17. So, my other friends and I had 5 close friends growing up, and I write about their lives to varying degrees. And, their lives didn't turn out so great. I had 2 friends who went to prison. I had one of my friends, he was shot to death. And I was the only one who got out of there. The 2 most common paths to get out of a town like that was you either go off to college or you join the military. And I joined the military. And, I started to write in those middling chapters about how life started to diverge from that point where, I was off to basic training and I was, undergoing all of the programs and improving myself and learning how to become an adult. Whereas my friends, they all turned 18 and, they moved into crappy apartments and started drinking even more than they already were and getting into parties. And, some of them in this holding pattern in community college. And then eventually, one of my friends was drinking and driving on his motorcycle and, crashed. And, all kinds of stupid things like that happened with my friends. And I could easily imagine, had I not signed those papers when I was 17 and shipped out to Lackland Air Force Base, that I would have done a lot of those same things and my life would have turned out very different. So, this is, for me, it was kind of the benefit of having that rigid structure where I knew what was expected of me. I was equipped with all the kinds of things that you would expect, discipline and camaraderie and role models and mentorship. And then also just the very tight connection between actions and outcomes, where, if you fail a drug test while you're enlisted, you'll be court-martialed and probably go to military prison. You'll suffer some kind of unpleasant penalty. Whereas in civilian life, if you're an 18 or 19-year-old kid, you can do a lot of drugs before the consequences catch up with you, right? Like you could do that for years before finally you start to see the signs of your own mistakes. Same with things like if you don't show up to work, if you're in the military and you don't come to work, like they will come to your house and, if you do that, more than once, you'll be put in handcuffs and be court-martialed. Like you have to be where they tell you to be at all times. And so they instill this in you right from like day one of basic training, that here's what's expected and here's what happens if you don't live up to those standards. And that was made clear to me. Whereas for my friends, there was such a lag between mistakes and consequences that, a lot of them were able to kind of go on one misadventure after another before it caught up with them. So I think that was another point too that I try to make.
Were
now,
these
all of this
mostly
being
like?
said, that
No, sorry.
all of this being said, like, it's tough because a lot of people ask me, like, is that the right option then? Should wayward, aimless young men all just go to the military? Do we need the national service? All this kind of thing. And I'm reluctant to say yes.
You're just
you
like
know,
Chad face, yes.
right,
You're like, yes, that's exact. They should all go to the military. Yeah.
But I'm slowly when the book came out last year, my answer was usually like kind of a qualified no. Like, it worked for me. Do your research. I wouldn't dissuade anyone, but I wouldn't say like we should coerce people into doing it in some kind of compulsory national service.
Right.
But then I sense this pattern because I've read enough memoirs of other people in similar circumstances. Probably the most prominent example is Hillbilly LG, right? JD Vance and his life, and then he went off to the Marines, and then things kind of improved from there. I just finished reading this other memoir called The Other Wes Moore, about this guy who's currently the governor of Maryland, and he's being touted as a potential Democratic nominee for 2028. But he grew up in the Bronx and in Baltimore, really tough life, ran the streets, and then his mom panics and forces him to go to this military academy when he's like 15, and then his life turns around from there. And then he became a Rhodes Scholar, and now he's a successful politician. And so I read I'm seeing these patterns, and I'm like, maybe it's not a terrible idea to just get more of these, feral young guys through these, this program. But, I guess I'm enough of a libertarian that I can't just, firmly and decisively say everyone should do this.
Yeah, you can't be for compulsory. Everybody should do it.
Yeah.
It would have been good for me. I kind of got all of the bitch acidness beat out in my fraternity in college.
Okay. Yeah. I think frats are great. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't. Again, it's like military would have been a much healthier version of that. But there was certainly limits that you got pushed to that were really important that I think very few men go through today, and that's a huge problem. And that's like exactly the Gen Z issue that you're saying. It's like these guys have not seen their limits. Like, your limits are so much further than you think they are. And you don't really know that unless you have this kind of period at some point in your life where you really push them. And I think the military is probably the most positive way to do that. Unless there's war going on, and then it can get very negative. But so all right, so you do the military, that kind of gets you on the straight and narrow. But then you go to Yale. So did you have any idea what you were getting into when you were going to Yale? Because that's like you were going into the belly of the beast in a whole different way, kind of, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier, the statistical unlikelihood of, it's, if you look at the stats for, overall average college graduation rates in the U.S., something like 35% of Americans over the age of 25 have a bachelor's degree. If you look at kids born in the bottom income quintile, essentially kids born in poor families in the U.S., 11% of them graduate from college. So it's much lower than the average of 35%. But if you look at the rates for foster kids, it's 3%.
Yeah,
so
it's right. Yeah.
In other words, if you're a poor child in the U.S., you are 4 times more likely to graduate from college than a foster kid.
Child. Right.
Which is, these stats, I point these out just kind of to indicate that, like, yes, poverty is bad, but I think instability is even worse. And so, I had this very winding indirect path to Yale, and I was 25 when I started college. I'd spent 8 years in the Air Force, and I remember kind of those first few weeks just being in a daze, like, I can't believe they let me in. This seems so unreal, and I was completely innocent to the kind of raging debates about the nature of higher education. What's the point of the university system? Is it to educate young people? Is it to pursue truth? Is it to seek some notion of social justice and equity? Is it, what are these institutions for? I didn't know any of that. I just thought, like, in my mind, college, I knew about college. Nobody I grew up around went to college. So all I knew about college was like what I saw on TV of just like young people, you go to class, maybe you go to a party and you hang out and, you just do your thing. And then I get here, and within a matter of weeks, I'm seeing these student uprisings, these protests, these marches for social justice, teach-ins. I became, involuntarily fluent in the language of social justice, not by choice, but just because I was so immersed in this environment where a lot of this stuff was being conceived. In 2015, it was still kind of this ongoing discussion like, oh, this is just a few one-off moments at these elite campuses. Who cares what's happening with these young people at elite schools? That's not real life. Or once these young people enter the workforce, they're going to have a rude awakening. And really the opposite happened, where it's not as if work changed the young people. These woke young
people changed the work. Right. It's like, everybody's like, oh, you get a gender studies major. Good luck in the workplace. And I was like, no, the workplace became gender studies. Like
the gender studies people joined HR.
Exactly.
Andrew Sullivan had that famous line about how we all live on campus now. I mean, he wrote that, I think, in like 2020. So, I mean, there's been a little bit of a cultural shift. But from, something like, Jonathan Haidt suggests something like 2012 to maybe 2022, roughly, like we went through this like very strange period. And I arrived at college kind of in the early stages of it in 2015. And then around that time, the mid 2010s, there were all kinds of protests and demonstrations. There was Yale, there was, the students at Princeton locked themselves in the president's office, the famous event at Evergreen College with Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying. And there were kind of, it was like every other week there was another story about this. And, I'm trying to understand this coming from where I came from, foster homes and the military and everything else. And now I'm seeing the sons and daughters of millionaires claiming that they felt unsafe because a professor wrote an email that they didn't like, or someone used an outdated term. And to me, it was just this bizarre double message that these universities were sending, where on the one hand, you would regularly hear from like the president or, some administrator or the professors, just these, compliments about, you're the future leaders of the world. You're also impressive. We selected you for this reason, and blah, blah, blah. Like a big part of these universities is just people kind of jacking each other off about how great it is that they're there. And so that's, the one hand, they're puffing you up, they're gassing you up about how great you are. But then on the other hand, anytime there was, a moment where, like I mentioned, a professor writes an email or someone uses the wrong word or someone doesn't give a trigger warning, it's like, we're so sorry that you're all being oppressed and marginalized and erased and mistreated, and we all promised to do better, and everyone's apologizing for everything. And so it's this mix of sort of high-minded arrogance and this exquisite sensitivity and thin-skinnedness. And it was hard for me to kind of understand what was happening here of like, okay, you're all, elite people who are going to go on to be rich. And at the same time, you're all like, oh, I'm so scared and unsafe and my life is so hard. And
well, that's the whole problem with the Marxist mindset. It's like, it's best embodied. Have you seen these new Nike ads that are all about winning at all costs? And it's like, one of them has, Willem Dafoe, this like great monologue where he's like, am I a bad person because I just want to win at all costs? I'm just going to win and like join my tribe of winners. Okay. And then all the imagery is like people in wheelchairs with no arms, and it's like, wait a second. What is this? Is this about equality or is this about winning? Like, you got to pick one. You can't be both. Like if you're going to be about how everybody's all equal, great, be like that. But then you can't also be like, we're all about winning. And oh, by the way, but unless we need to have a special league for people with one arm because they need to be participation. It's like, I think that's kind of why the elites really fell, because that contradiction became too great. It's like, okay, are you elite or are you not at all elite? Like, you got to kind of pick one in a way.
Yeah. Well, it was this weird thing where like part of what where your authority stems from is kind of how much of a victim you are.
Right.
So it's on the one hand, it's like you get into these universities, statistically, you had at least one parent who graduated from college. You're probably in like the top income decile. Like, you had all these advantages in your life. and that's what gets you in the door. And then once you're there, it's like, well, now how do you gain status? How do you stand out amid all of this undifferentiated academic excellence? And it's like, oh, I'm a victim. I have,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
you attempt to sort of mine your history and your identity for whatever commonalities you share with historically marginalized groups. And
Right.
so you see, I mean, then it would have, you'd have these bizarre situations where, someone who grew up in like kind of the most tolerant and accepting and affluent liberal parts of the country, who, they happen to be gay, they would talk about how they were oppressed as a result of this when
Right.
they personally shared nothing. They did not personally experience any of the suffering or mistreatment that gay people in decades past have. Or you would have kind of, African elites, attempts to co-opt the black slave
Oh, the black, right.
experience.
It's like, oh yeah, I'm
And
black and I'm actually a prince from Nigeria.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
and then they would say like, oh,
Right.
they would attempt to co-opt that
Yeah.
suffering. You saw it with Asian students. You saw that with, I mean, the funniest thing is like, I had a friend at Yale who was, he was a Mexican guy. He grew up in a border town in Texas. And he would say like, I'm going to tell you right now, like most of the, Hispanic, Latinx people on campus, like they're kind of inflating their own kind of ethnic origins, where you'd meet people who would claim to have like a Cuban grandfather or something. Like, basically like his point was like, if you look at Hispanics in the border towns in Texas and you look at Hispanics at Yale, they look very different.
Not the
And
same Hispanic.
yeah, but they would claim like,
Yeah.
oh, I have this, this shared oppressive history, and therefore I personally am a victim. And now you have this credential to speak about social justice issues, and other people are required to listen to you. And it was just, all these teach-ins, all of these demonstrations. And I had an apartment in downtown New Haven. And, for some of your listeners who may not know, New Haven, so Yale is like, it's Yale, but then you have New Haven, which is the town it's located in, which is a very kind of impoverished, blue collar, like there's a lot of poverty, a lot of addiction. It looks really bad, like right outside of the bubble of the university. And I had an apartment downtown, so I would go to class and hear these students, talk about how oppressed they are or whatever, how much they care about social justice. And then I would walk through 4 or 5 blocks of addiction and poverty and mental illness and everything else. And I would, that sort of clash of, what they were saying versus what I would see every day, it just got to be too much for me. And so, yeah, the final kind of third of the book, I just like unload and I talk about just how distasteful and kind of repellent all of this was for me. And yeah, to this day, I'll never forget it. Part of it was just because that was my introduction to campus culture. Within a matter of weeks, all this stuff happened, and I'm like, okay, so this is what elite universities are like. And it wasn't just Yale. I did an internship at Stanford. I did a PhD at Cambridge. Like I spent a lot of time in and around elite academia. And by the time 2020 rolled around, I was like, wow, it only took 5 years from what I saw at Yale to what we're seeing now at the height of the madness of 2020.
Yeah. New Haven, very run down, but best pizza in the world.
Oh yeah,
Somehow.
yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
It's very weird. I don't know. It's
I think they
it's
have
the-
like there was like an Italian enclave. I don't know if it's probably it's kind of diminished since, but I think in the early 20th century there were kind of Italian neighborhoods, and they like a lot of those pizza joints are like family owned, and yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, my mom actually lived in New Haven briefly, and it's exactly as you describe. And for some reason, even David Chang says this on his show. It is the best pizza on the planet. They call it a pizza. It's like a whole different thing. It's like its own style. It's unbelievable. Worth going there, literally just for that. So yeah, okay. So you're clearly arriving at this concept that you then later on and today are known for, which is luxury beliefs. So it sounds like you're kind of talking about this luxury beliefs thing. So did you coin that word? Where did your idea around luxury beliefs come from?
Yeah, well, luxury beliefs I define as ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And the idea, so the phrase itself, luxury beliefs, that didn't enter my mind, and I didn't start writing about it until I was in graduate school. So this is 2019. But the idea started to take shape in my mind during those interactions at Yale. So, I would hear opinions and ideas at that campus that I had never heard in my life before, not in the foster homes, not in Red Bluff, not in the military. And then suddenly I'm hearing students talk about, decarceration. We should empty the prisons. We should reimagine the justice system. We should evolve beyond marriage and monogamy. We should just decriminalize all hard drugs. It was just sort of one thing after the other. And, this kind of extreme social liberalism that, and I considered myself at that time kind of a moderate. I kind of joke that when I was in the military, I was the token liberal. And then when I got to Yale, I was the token conservative. And even though my views hadn't changed at all. And so, but I'm hearing all of these like radical views. And these were kind of the most popular views on campus. Some of them I'm uncertain if they were kind of statistically the most common. But then if you look at the actual data, if you sort of break down survey data as far as like, asking people, is it important for a child to be raised by two married parents? And you break down the responses by socioeconomic status, the higher you go, the less likely people are to say yes. But then, so essentially, like the richer you are, the more likely you are to think like, oh, it doesn't matter. At least that's what you say. Verbally, you'll say, oh, it doesn't matter how a child is raised. Children are just as likely to succeed in every kind of family structure. But then when you look at what people actually do, the higher up you go in socioeconomic status, the more likely people are to be married before they have children, and the less likely they are to get divorced. And so there's this contradiction between what they say and what they do. And this is true for a variety of different behaviors, whether it's sort of body positivity or decriminalization of drugs or attitudes around technology use, so on and so forth. Defund the police, which came later. But, if you break down the survey data, there were multiple surveys conducted in 2020 and 2021, which found that the highest income Americans were the most in support of defunding the police, and the lowest income Americans were the least in support. And then even if you just look at Democrats, white Democrats were more in favor of defunding the police than Black and Hispanic Democrats. And this was especially true for white Democrats who had gone to college. And so there is this kind of boutique luxury idea that, okay, well, if the masses believe one thing, if conventional opinion is X, then the way that I signal my sophistication is by expressing what I call a luxury belief. And so, yeah, and to answer your question, so I did come up with that term. It has its own Wikipedia page, which credits me. Some people don't believe Wikipedia, which, I don't necessarily blame them. But in this case, you can believe Wikipedia, that it credits me as the originator of this phrase. And, there are a lot of different kinds of sociological frameworks, modern empirical psychology that I draw on. If you want to get into it, we can. But essentially, my claim is that luxury beliefs have, to a large extent, supplanted luxury goods, which I'm not saying that luxury goods aren't important, or that people still don't signal their status with luxury goods. They still play a role in society. But because luxury goods are increasingly a noisier signal of one's social rank, where you fall in society, the way that you do this now is through expressions of what some sociologists call cultural capital. What are your opinions? What are your ideas? What are your tastes? What are your socio-political views? And increasingly, those indicate your level of education, how much money you make, what kind of job you have, what kind of media you consume, whether you're, a member of the unwashed proletariat masses, or whether you're kind of either a bourgeois or elite or aspiring elite member of society, whether you went to a selective college and so on. And there's a little bit of overlap with political views, but I try to make clear here that even if you just look at Democrats, college-educated Democrats are way more likely to support a lot of this than working-class Democrats, which is one reason among many why you saw, I think, in 2024, this kind of shift among a lot of blue-collar, especially non-white men, shifting over to the Republican side.
It's so weird. It's such a strange thing. It's really insightful to think about it as like it replacing luxury products. Have you ever read a book called Class by a guy named Paul Fussell?
Oh yeah. I reference him in the later chapters of the book. I think it's fantastic. It's it's
so
like
good.
It was written like 40 years ago, so there are kind of some things in there that don't apply, but overall, it's still well worth reading. And I think that was the first book on class I ever read, and it was like a whole new world opened up to me, where suddenly I was able to understand so much more about class. It was something I hadn't really given much thought to before, but it's, Class by Paul Fussell. So good.
So good. But even then, I think he's getting into the real true top classes. Objects become less and less important, actually. Like the signals really lose their importance. And the signals are much more important for like the middle and the upper middle and even just like this cusp of the upper. And that's true in my experience. Like when you go to when you deal with like real elites, the stuff is not like the signals aren't there really, but they have to signal something. Like they still are going to be playing the game some way, and beliefs are a great way to do it, right? It's like I think that's really deft. But the crazy thing about what you're saying, and this is why luxury beliefs is such a good concept, has this cognitive dissonance always been true? Like rules for thee, not for me. We've heard that a million times. Or this thing of like, you shouldn't get married, but I should. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's more innocent than that. Maybe it's just like, I am married and I don't care. Has this hypocrisy always been there in the upper classes? Or is the hypocrisy itself new?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's funny, like as a writer, you hope you've come upon something truly original, and then you dig through the literature and you read a lot of books and you attempt to inform yourself about kind of the history of whatever topic you're writing about, and then you discover nothing's truly original. So it was only after I had written the book and after I'd written, a lot of essays about luxury beliefs in my Substack and various outlets that a reader sent me a passage from a novel called Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, which was published in 1881. And in this novel, it's a fictional novel. Two characters are discussing social class. And one of the characters, and this is like a verbatim line, says something like, the beliefs of the upper class radicals are their biggest luxury. Like that is almost a verbatim quote. And I'm like, this was 150 years ago. And so I'm like, okay, well, Henry James got there first. Okay. He didn't say luxury beliefs. He came close, but not quite. And then later, another reader notified me of this passage from, I think it's The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith, which was like predates Henry James by a century. This was like 1772, I think. And in this passage, Adam Smith talks about how the aristocrats of his day would essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but they would live by one set of beliefs, but espouse a different set of beliefs. And that if they were to espouse the beliefs they lived by, they would be embarrassed by this. Like they would feel a bit self-conscious about talking about being responsible, being moderate, being abstinent, being responsible, and all of those kinds of things. And so even in Adam Smith's day, he was pointing out this kind of duplicity among the elites where they would live one way, but then say something else. And so, I guess at this point, my only true claim to originality is the phrase luxury beliefs, which I think encapsulates the idea very well. But as far as kind of the history of it, it seems like it's been around for a while, where elites have always, to one degree or another, attempted to distinguish themselves from the masses by the movements they support, the opinions they hold, the tastes that they cultivate.
I think maybe what's changed is that, like, it seems like they don't. I mean, it's true. Like, if this was going on in Henry James's day, like it's been going on forever, but there does seem to be like a kind of it's like a belief in like take the trans thing. The elites are transing their kids though. You know what I mean? Like they're doing it. Like they're not. It's not that they're saying you guys over here go be trans and we won't. They are doing it themselves. So
some
it's
of
like
them, yeah. I mean, I would be curious. I would like to look at kind of the patterns overall. Like I know there are sort of very visible and very, very salient examples of
what are the real
celebrities.
numbers?
Yeah, but if we could actually look at, because there are, Hollywood elites and celebrities and billionaires that get divorced, for example, and those get a lot of coverage and a lot of discussion in the media. But when you actually look at the data, it's like, rich people are far less likely to get divorced than like an average person. So, and I've seen like kind of shocking stats. Wesley Yang sent me he writes a lot about trans stuff and he tweets a lot about it, but he sent me this report on foster kids, and some shockingly high, I don't know what it is, like 20 or 30% of foster kids are now either identifying as LGBT or as trans or whatever. And to me, I can't help but wonder if part of that is just like they are feeling ignored and neglected and whatever, and they're just adopting this identity because they get a little bit more attention for it. But anyway, yeah. So I think like one of the points about the luxury beliefs is like generally they don't live by those beliefs. However, even if they do, they are still in a position to deal with the fallout of them. And so, if you're a rich person and you want to trans your kid, you can afford to, go through the process of it. But then if the kid decides that they don't want to do it, then you're in a financial position to, once you pass a certain threshold, there's no going back. But up until a certain point, you can pay to kind of, fix your mistake. Whereas if you're, a poor person and you don't have the resources to do it, you can just,
right. I think that's what it is. I think it's that it's like even in the Communist Manifesto, I always reference this. There's like a throwaway line in the Communist Manifesto that nobody ever talks about, where he's basically says, hey, the rich have community of wives. We should have community of wives. And he's basically saying that they don't believe actually in monogamy. Why should the common man believe in monogamy? And I've always found that really, really fascinating. And I think it's exactly as you say. It's like the elites used to, like in the English days, send their kid to war, get married, because the projection of the common rule was important. They felt the responsibility, even though maybe behind the scenes they did weird stuff and, maybe they snuck out of actually fighting in the war or whatever it was. But they at least had the pressure to pretend to do it, Yeah. And I think that's what's missing with our current elites. It's like, especially tech people, it always strikes me the people who are like, I'm poly. It's like, and it's like, why they're trying to have it both ways. They're like, I'm elite and responsible for society, but I don't want to deal with the hypocrisy of cheating. So therefore I have to say that I'm poly, but that's really, really toxic to society, because then everybody thinks they can be poly. And it's like, no, you can't be. And it's like the same with trans, what you're saying. Everybody can't deal with this. Maybe the really, really rich can, but everybody shouldn't be dealing with it. Right.
Yeah. Well, there's always been some degree of elite hypocrisy. But one thing that I appreciate, because you mentioned, okay, the elites of old, they would, say you should get married or you should serve in war or whatever. And then in their private life, they wouldn't always live up to the ideals that they were publicly espousing, which is kind of a form of hypocrisy. But our elites today are almost the reverse. I sometimes refer to what I call the JFK model of elite hypocrisy, where Kennedy was like part of like that dying era, maybe one of the few of that generation, or the last of that generation rather, where publicly, he basically, like we know now in his private life, he was an imperfect person. He was a philanderer. He would cheat. He was often an absentee father, addicted to drugs, and so on. But he still thought it was important to project the image to the American public of being a good father and a good husband and a family man, a dutiful, responsible person. And today we almost have the reverse of that, where there's an author, he's a Yale law professor, Daniel Markovits. He refers to the modern elites as non-practicing libertines, where publicly they will espouse, poly and open relationships and drug use and XYZ, but then privately they generally tend to live pretty bourgeois lives.
They're actually right. It's the reverse. Yeah, it's the reverse.
Yeah. Where I think the old elites would, they would talk the 50s and then live the 60s, whereas now the modern elites they walk the 50s and talk the 60s, right? Whereas
Yeah. That's really dead on. That's really true. So when you're with these elites, when you're with these Ivy League people, and I'm like you, like I've always, as you get, I spend so much of my time just being so disgusted with these people that it was just overwhelming. But then over time, you're like, all right, well, it's just the way they are. Like you can't let it bother you. But when you're around these people, they're all, as I think you said something also very profound, which is that actually instability is worse than poverty. And these people all have stability, right? That's what they all come from. They come from stability, and that's why they've been able to statistically get to these new levels because they had this stable environment. You and I come from unstable environments, but do you ever, and you've learned how to play this game very well. You've learned how to do this stuff and signal in the right ways and all this stuff. Do you feel the like savage beast within though? Like when you're around them, like do you feel like, do you have to like consciously not succumb to that? Because like, genetically and culturally and all these things, you're from a fucking foreign planet to them. So like, how do you deal with that? That's what was always the hardest with me. I would just be so disgusted by them, and I'd be like, I just couldn't contain the savage within, So I don't know. How did you learn how to control that?
Yeah, well, I think part of it was, I have, all those experiences, like, going through the military, learning self-control, learning how to contain my feelings, and, and earlier we mentioned, the ability to kind of detach and switch off. And I think that comes in handy. Increasingly, as I've gotten a bit older and a bit more, I don't know, just sort of breadth of perspective, I realize, we're all kind of born into the circumstances we're born into. And, it's like as if they, they didn't know anything else other than this very sort of materially comfortable, stable life where they were always expected to succeed. There was never a question of, whether they would succeed, but how. And there's always going to be a bit of a blind spot there. Now, that being said, I do think historically, as far as elites go, our elites, they're far from the worst elites of any society that's ever existed. I think a lot of them mean well. They want to do the right thing. They've been told that there's a certain way to be a good person. Some of them are realizing that's actually not true. A lot of them are curious and are attempting to, understand and reconsider the received wisdom that they've been inculcated with. So
well, we've had it hasn't been easy to convince them. I mean, they pretty much tried to kill all of us for 10 years because they didn't want to just listen to what we were trying to tell them. But it is nice that now it does seem like they're listening, to some degree, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, fortunately, we still live in a relatively free society where we have, democracy, the political system, we have the free market. So, it's funny, like whenever elites attempt to, like when they capture an organization and climbing up that organization or success in that organization depends on the opinions of your fellows, in an elite university or in, certain kinds of media or whatever, it's like, oh, well, you succeed in this environment by winning over and persuading other elites to like you. Whereas once, certain ideas or products are put to the marketplace, whether in politics or in Hollywood or whatever, it's like, what are the box office receipts or who won this election? And now everyone else gets involved. And now you actually have to sort of, see, like, do ordinary people support this or not? And, I think a lot of them they have this difficulty. A lot of elite institutions, elites in general, they're like trapped because on the one hand, they want to impress their fellow elites, but on the other hand, they still have to, win elections, or they still have to sell tickets.
Right.
and so I think a lot of them are struggling with this kind of internal dissonance.
Well, and I think that's when the culture turns over, is when that divide becomes too impossible. Yeah. Right. It's like when there's like Alyssa Heinerscheid with Bud Light. Alyssa Heinerscheid's Ivy League. She's living in this $8 million condo on the park, and she's going to her dinner parties. She's doing luxury beliefs all day, trans, but she's selling Bud Light. She's in charge of selling Bud Light. And so she puts the trans in the Bud Light, and then boom, explosion, because it's like you can't, the dissonance is too big. And I think that when the dissonance gets to a certain size, everything sort of implodes and the elites get turned over. I mean, have you ever gotten into Walter Lippmann at all?
I'm familiar with some of the work, but I haven't done sort of a thorough read.
Yeah. So Lippmann's the guy behind stereotypes, the original idea of stereotypes. And, his thing of stereotypes is actually not like, black people be like this. It's like, it's your stereotype of the world is a map that you project upon the world to do shortcuts because you can't possibly know everything. So you kind of like have this shortcut map, and that's your stereotype. And then all the information you receive, you see through that lens, right? If you're right wing, everything you hear and see, you do the shortcut of like, well, it's the damn commies again, and everybody has this. Everybody does this. It's not just elites or not. So his theory is, since we're all sort of stunted in this way, the elite class or the expert class has to rise, and they're the ones that can actually know everything. And there's an in-group and an out-group, and the only job of the democracy is to kick out the in-group and kick out the out-group of the elites that know everything, right? And I think that, I don't believe this, but I think that framework is kind of good. And exactly as you're saying, like, really the job of Yale, this is to make the elites like each other. It's like to train people to be part of this top crust. And really, they're not that concerned with the opinions of the others until they start getting kicked out, kind of.
Yeah. Until they run for office, or until they, try to promote a movie and it flops at the box office.
Yeah.
And then they realize, like, oh, there's a certain kind of, our vision of what's entertaining and the moral message of our stories aren't landing with people. And I think it's hard because, the way you climb up is by being an elite and by opposing the masses.
Right.
And then, but then success is defined by kind of winning them over. And this is, there's that tension there too. And, it's a good point. I mean, these institutions, they talk a big game about, social justice and equity and inclusion and all these kinds of things, when literally they are like among the most exclusive, least equitable institutions on the planet. Like, getting into these places is very difficult, and you have to meet a certain standard. And then once you're there, it's like, it's the rhetoric versus what they actually do. It's so mismatched. What they do is they groom elites, and they're, like you said, you get them to like each other, put them on a certain track, and get them to recognize that this is, kind of where you're going in society. But then, publicly they espouse, equity, which I guess in their definition of equity, it's, as long as the ruling class mirrors the demographics of society as a whole, somehow if whatever the president of Harvard is black, then somehow, that means that, poor people in the inner city have accomplished something, which is not at all true. But in their mind, there's this idea that I call, trickle down diversity of, oh, well, if we could just, play musical chairs at elite universities, then somehow those magically will benefit people who look like them, but are much poorer and much more impoverished and marginalized. And that's just not the case. I mean, it doesn't work for white people, right? Like, why would it work for anyone else? Like, if the president of Harvard is a white guy, what does that mean for people in Appalachia? Nothing. But in their mind, they think, oh, well, if, whatever, like this high-ranking position is given to a woman, then somehow women everywhere are going to benefit as a result. And that's just not that's not like, where's the mechanism there? They understand this logic when it comes to trickle-down economics, that, like somehow letting rich people keep their money is going to magically accrue to the bottom. And they are perfectly willing to criticize that logic. But then when it comes to this other kind of trickle-down benefit, they are completely blind to what they're saying.
Yeah, totally. Okay, in this last 20 minutes here, I just want to talk about the book itself, because there's this whole story about the New York Times bestseller exclusion. How hard was it to get this book published, first of all? Like, what was that like? And then what was the reception? And then what happened with the New York Times?
Yeah, well, so getting the deal itself, I don't think there was any kind of... It was hard, but I think it was hard for very conventional reasons, which is that, I got a literary agent, and then we shopped the proposal around, and we weren't getting much in the way of interest. But that was in part because I didn't have, what people call a platform. I had a couple thousand followers on Twitter at this time. I didn't have a newsletter. Just didn't have much of an online presence. And increasingly, if you want to get a book deal, you either have to be like an A-list celebrity, or you have to have kind of a large sort of self-made online audience that the publisher is thinking to themselves, if we give this person a book deal, can they move at least 25,000 units? Like, that's kind of the bottom line. And if you can't, then you're probably not going to get a deal unless you have, extraordinary connections or something, which I didn't have. And so it took, something like 2 years before we finally got interest from a major publisher. But that was because during that 2-year period, I was building an online presence, and I started a newsletter, and my Twitter started to take off. And so finally got the deal. That wasn't that hard. Getting the book and everything, like, it just was a kind of, very bland, like, typical story about like someone who didn't have connections trying to get a deal and then finally getting it. But then the book comes out, and by that point I had a successful Substack, large online following. The book sold very well that first week with pre-orders and everything else. And my publisher calls me and says, so we have some good news. Your book made the USA Today bestseller list. It made Publishers Weekly. It was #1 on like Apple audiobooks. Like, basically did very well. But then it tells me that it wasn't on the New York Times bestseller list, despite outselling like basically most of the books on the list. It should have debuted, I think, at #3 or #4, but it wasn't listed at all. And this was such a surprise to my agent and to the publisher that they wrote a letter to the New York Times asking, what happened, and they got this boilerplate response basically saying, the books on the list are not determined by sales rank alone, but also they have this proprietary formula where it's like X number of books, weighted percentage from Amazon, and then from indie bookstores, and then from this and that and the other. And it is a kind of a way to game the system, because, for example, they calculate how many books you sold at an indie bookstore. Indie bookstores tend to be owned and operated by people who are kind of on the political left. And if they don't carry your book in their store, then you don't get counted as selling books from an indie bookstore. And, if you're a conservative author, or at least not a progressive one, then they're going to be less likely to carry your book in the first place. So it's an interesting kind of game they're playing there. And then, so anyway, I wrote about this experience, about, this bizarre omission. And fortunately, my Substack did well. And like I mentioned, and then, someone from The Economist contacted me, and he said, like, tell me more about what happened. We're doing our own internal analysis of the list. Eventually, they write this splashy piece, which basically found that there is political bias in the New York Times bestseller list, where if you have 2 books, one written by a liberal author and one by a conservative author, and they sell the same number of books, the liberal author is more likely to be placed on the New York Times bestseller list. Interestingly, even if a conservative author is listed on the New York Times list, they're more likely to drop off the following week compared with a liberal author, even when you control for the number of units sold. And so as a conservative, it's harder to get on the list, and then it's harder to stay on the list. And so, and this was all new to me. I'm a new first-time author. I thought, well, it's the New York Times bestseller list. And then I learned it's actually not a list of books that sell the best. It's a list of books that sell pretty well. It's like holistic admissions, where, it's the book did well, but we also want to put our thumb on the scale for, authors that are a good fit and that we like and that have a good message and so on and so forth. And so I basically, I'm realizing, like, okay, well, New York Times list, it's a nice to have, but it's not really, it doesn't mean that your book actually sold as well as you might think.
Right. So who is the audience for this book? If it seems like it did very, very well, and it seems like your Substack is doing very well. How did it find its audience? Like, who is this for? So, because it's not like super right wing or anything. This isn't like, right? It's not like this is like the Rush Limbaugh audience. So,
it's I intentionally attempted to not be overtly political. At one point in the early drafts of the manuscript, I have this line about how my mom and her partner, they drove a pickup truck and they had a John Kerry bumper sticker. This was 2004. So they were working class Democrats, in a town that was more so Republican. But I mean, it was, at that point, politics just was not all consuming like it is now. So it wasn't a big deal. But I took that part out of the book. because I just didn't want it to be politicized in any way. Although in hindsight, maybe I should have left it in. It would have won me some points with the lefties. But I thought to myself, yeah, who is this book for? And I thought, it's for basically anyone who cares about social class, who cares about what's happening with families in this country, who is curious about what's happening at elite universities. And, but I didn't necessarily have a kind of prototypical reader in mind. I'll say generally the book did kind of, it did seem to have sort of widespread appeal, which is why I think it did pretty well. Sort of, the 4 quadrants of older men, older women, younger women. Generally, there seems to be interest in this book. And I'm noticing among ordinary readers across the political spectrum, people are resonating with it. But then the way the book was received by media, it was different. It was generally more warmly received by conservative media than mainstream media. But that being said, it wasn't. There was one hit piece written in the Washington Post.
Really? Saying
yeah.
what? What was their?
They basically, in my view, intentionally misconstrued the message. This woman, she basically said, like, Henderson says education isn't important, but education helped him, and isn't he kicking the ladder down? Something like that. When I did not say education is unimportant. I said education is good and it's nice to have, but we should be focusing on the family at least as much as we focus on education. But it was a complete, I think, like they wanted to write something bad about it, and they did. But but overall, it was generally well received. The Atlantic wrote, Connor Friedersdorf at The Atlantic wrote something pretty nice about it. So I can't complain overall. But there were a couple of interesting things that happened. One was the omission from the New York Times list, and then the other was last year when I was doing kind of the first round, like the initial push for the book tour. No bookstores were willing to host my book event.
Wow! What?
Yeah.
That's insane.
It's weird for me to even it's hard to complain because the book did well, but it was weird. Like at that time, there was still some uncertainty about how successful it would be, and I like bookstores. I've always liked bookstores, and so I thought the idea of speaking in one and bringing readers in and just that kind of environment would have been so nice. But yeah, the bookstores were unwilling to host me, and of course, they're not going to give an actual reason for it. There could be different. It could be political. It could also be they looked at the blurbs of the book and they saw names like J.D. Vance and Jordan Peterson and thought, okay, we're not going to have this right-wing weirdo in our bookstore. Who knows what the reasoning was.
Well, bookstores are the most. I mean, everywhere in the country, it's they were the most masked, places anywhere. Wow, that's crazy. So today though, who's your audience on Substack? Who is your people? It's because you have a ton of subscribers, and it sounds like you got your agent, and then they were basically, hey, you need to grow your audience. You grew your audience, and then they re-dangled the book, and it worked. So who reads your Substack?
Yeah, well, it's hard to I wanted to do one of these reader demographic surveys. I've seen other Substackers do this, where you collect gender, ethnicity, age, political orientation, all those kinds of things. But my impression, having not done one of those surveys, I think it's kind of a mix primarily of tech people, finance people. A lot of academics read it too. Basically, kind of disgruntled and disillusioned liberals. A lot of them read my Substack because I'm not overtly, outwardly a stern conservative. I don't write in that way. You can kind of read between the lines and see where my political sympathies are. But I'm not an annoying, obnoxious, in-your-face conservative. And so I think a lot of non-woke liberals like my writing for that reason.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to get a different point of view. And then a lot of conservatives read my work too, educated, curious conservatives who work and live in metropolitan areas and are surrounded by liberals. They like my work too. And it's probably, I would estimate something 75% male. My writing style is, it's not flowery, it's not ornate. I think men kind of resonate with that writing style more. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a varied, educated group of mix of conservatives and non-woke liberals.
All right. So what's next?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I should say, like, a lot of young men read my stuff too, and then I've noticed a lot of mothers of young men, so like middle-aged women who have like sons in their teens and 20s, because I think they're concerned with what's happening with young men in this country. A lot of those women tend to be non-woke liberals who are concerned with the direction of the left, especially because they have sons and see kind of the rhetoric around, how we shouldn't like men. But then they have sons, and so they somehow came across my writing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what's next? I mean, I have a lot of essays I want to write for Substack still, and I write regularly for various outlets. I have this column at the Boston Globe and at the Free Press, and just visiting different universities.
Another book?
I'm wrestling with this idea of another book, Isaac, because like I wonder, like, what's the point of writing a book? Like, why do people write books? So one would be to get an idea out there. Like, the only book I would write at this point would be a luxury beliefs book.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, if I wanted to get the idea is already out there. Like, people use this term already. Another reason would be to kind of bolster my credibility as a speaker or writer or something. Oh, he wrote a book, but I don't think I'd need that. And then, the other would be money. Substack's doing well. The first book sold. So I'm still like wrestling, like, is it worth the time and the effort, the opportunity cost to write a whole book about luxury beliefs? And it's also one of those things where, and I'm sure you've seen this and many of your listeners too, it's like, this book could have been an essay.
Yeah.
And I've written a lot of essays about luxury beliefs. You get the idea right away. Do I need to write 250 pages about this very true, intuitive idea?
Very true. It is a good point. The luxury of beliefs book, it's like there's a lot of really good superficial reasons to do it, but it would definitely be one of those this could have been an essay books. Yeah, that's a great point. And this is why people don't write books, is for this exact reason. All right, dude. Well, thank you so much. Wait, I have one last question. And this, sure. Have you looked at your Wikipedia picture recently?
Yeah, I have. So it's funny. There we go. Yeah.
So I know you're from the hood, but I don't know if black and mild in the Wikipedia picture is necessary.
I wish that was a freaked black and mild, but it's actually it's not. It's a clove cigarette.
Oh, it's a clove cigarette. Okay, I was gonna say.
Yeah, I ran into that kid next to me.
I know him. I know that guy.
Yeah. A lot of people in our circles know him. And so I happened to be walking down the street in Cambridge, England, and this group of young guys they stop me. Hey, you're Rob Henderson. Can we get a picture? That kind of thing. And I happened to be smoking a cigarette, and they're like, "Hey, take a drag. Let's get a picture. Let's do a selfie." And I'm like, "Yeah, all right." And I had zero idea that would end up on Wikipedia. I don't know how to edit Wikipedia. Like, I just, I saw that and I'm like, well, I guess that's it now.
It's cool. It's good. All right, dude. Well, hey, thank you so much for your time. This was really, really great. Of course, I'll put the links to your Substack. That seems to be your main thing, the Substack. So, and it's not a Substack URL. You have a luxury URL. It's your name. But yeah, thank you so much, man. This was really great. And please do stay in touch.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Isaac. This has been great.
Cool. I'm going to play the music and you can just go. All right, bye.
Yeah, take care.